She walked into the lab that morning expecting nothing more than another ordinary day of teaching. But what followed was anything but ordinary. In a room meant for learning, a bully's hand closed tightly around the throat of a black teacher, silencing her voice, her dignity, her very breath. The walls that should have echoed with knowledge now carried the weight of fear. Yet what neither the bully nor the students knew was that her husband held the power to rewrite this moment forever. And when he did, the bully's future shattered in an instant. For years, teaching had been more than just a job for Maya. It was her calling. As one of the few black science teachers in the district, she carried both pride and pressure each time she stepped into the lab. Her students admired her for her patience, her passion, and the way she made complicated lessons feel like discoveries. To them, she wasn't just a teacher. She was a mentor, a guide, and sometimes the only person who believed in them. At home, life seemed stable. Her husband, a self-made millionaire, had built his fortune from the ground up. Despite his wealth, he admired Maya's humility and dedication more than any business deal he ever closed. Together, they lived quietly, two worlds balanced between his success and her devotion to shaping young minds. But in classrooms, respect is not always guaranteed. Among the laughter and curiosity, there were shadows, students who carried anger, resentment, and cruelty. Maya had noticed one boy in particular, whose smirk often turned to sneers, whose gaze lingered with defiance. She brushed it off, hoping patience could break through. What she didn't know was that this ordinary day in the lab would push that defiance into violence and set in motion a chain of events no one could undo. The day began like any other. Students shuffling into the lab, the low buzz of chatter filling the room. Maya adjusted her glasses, her hands busy arranging beakers and notes, her mind already on the lesson. She'd learned to carry herself with calm authority, but deep down she knew not every student walked through those doors ready to respect her. At the back of the room sat Jason, the boy whose smirk she'd grown used to. His posture screamed defiance, his eyes sharp with the kind of arrogance that feeds on testing limits. For weeks, he had whispered insults just low enough that others could laugh, but not loud enough for discipline to stick. It wasn't just teenage rebellion, it was venom, sharpened by prejudice. To him, Maya wasn't a teacher. She was an easy target. That morning, his muttered words turned darker. "She doesn't belong here. Why should we listen to her?" Each phrase seemed to slice through the lesson, louder, bolder, as if daring her to respond. The other students shifted uncomfortably, the tension palpable, but no one spoke up. The silence of bystanders is heavy. It gives cruelty permission to grow. Maya tried to steady her voice, continuing the experiment. But Jason wasn't finished. He slammed a book onto the table, stood up, and began pacing like a predator circling prey. The class froze. Maya's heart thudded against her ribs, but she stood firm, refusing to let fear show. Still, she could feel the unspoken truth in the room. Being both a woman and black, authority was too often questioned, too often stripped away. Then it happened. In a flash of rage, Jason closed the distance between them. His hand shot out, fingers wrapping tightly around her throat. The room erupted. Gasps, chairs scraping, the shock of violence breaking the fragile order. Maya's breath caught as the grip tightened. The lab, her sanctuary of learning, suddenly felt like a cage. Every second stretched like an eternity. She could see the faces of her students, frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. She could feel the burn of his grip, the sting of humiliation, the weight of centuries of struggle pressing onto her in that single act of hate. Somewhere in the chaos, someone ran to call for help. Others whispered frantically, their fear mixing with disbelief. How could this be happening here, in plain sight, in a place meant for knowledge and growth? Maya's vision blurred, her knees buckling, but deep inside, something stronger than fear kept her upright. defiance. She refused to be erased. She refused to collapse under his hatred. And just when it seemed the situation would spiral beyond repair, the door opened. Footsteps entered. A presence filled the room. Steady, powerful, unyielding. The bully's grip faltered for the first time, but his arrogance hadn't left. He didn't know who had just walked in, because the man who stepped through that doorway wasn't just a husband. He was someone with influence, power, and a resolve that would turn this moment of cruelty into a turning point Jason would never escape. The air in the lab was suffocating, thick with fear. Jason's hand still lingered on Maya's throat, his grip trembling not from mercy, but from rage. The students had pressed themselves against the walls, caught between terror and disbelief, their silence screaming louder than any words. And in the doorway stood her husband, his presence commanding the entire room. For a split second, the world seemed frozen. The sound of Maya's lab equipment clinking to the floor echoed like a gunshot, the only noise in a room held hostage by violence. Her husband's eyes locked onto the sight before him, his wife gasping for breath, her dignity crushed beneath the hands of a boy who thought power came from cruelty. He moved forward, each step deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who had built his life through battles much harsher than this one. Jason's smirk faltered, but his arrogance hadn't left. He released her, only to throw his arms wide in mock defiance, as if daring anyone to stop him. But what he didn't understand was that he had already lost. This wasn't just a scuffle in a classroom. This was an act of hate, a violation that reached far beyond teenage rebellion. And standing across from him was a man with the resources, the influence, and the fire to make sure this moment would define Jason's life forever. Maya's husband didn't shout, didn't lash out. He simply placed a protective arm around his wife, steadying her trembling frame, and in that silence, a storm began to gather. The look in his eyes wasn't anger alone, it was promise. A promise that Jason's cruelty would not be forgotten, that the grip around Maya's throat would be the last time he held any power over anyone. The lab door closed behind them, but the story was only beginning. Because outside those walls, consequences waited. And for Jason, the future he once believed was his, was about to be dismantled piece by piece. In the days that followed, the incident in the lab was no longer a secret whispered in hallways. It was everywhere. Jason's arrogance, once shielded by silence, collapsed under the weight of consequences. Her husband made sure of it. Legal action, school board hearings, and public exposure stripped away the future Jason once thought untouchable. The world that had encouraged his cruelty was forced to confront what he had done. For Maya, the bruises on her neck healed, but the scar of humiliation lingered deeper. She had devoted her life to teaching, to lifting others with knowledge, only to be reminded how quickly her worth could be questioned because of the color of her skin. Yet through her pain, she found strength, not just in her husband's defense, but in her own resilience. She refused to let that act define her. Instead, she chose to stand taller, louder, more unshakable than before. But this story was never just about one classroom, one teacher, or one bully. It was a reflection of a larger truth, that racism doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it stands in plain sight, testing whether anyone will stand against it. Too often, silence protects the bully, while justice waits for someone with power to speak. The lab became a symbol, not of fear, but of resistance. And as for Jason, his downfall was a reminder that hate may roar loudly, but it cannot outlast the weight of truth. So the question remains, how many more teachers, students, and innocent lives must bear the grip of prejudice before we decide enough is enough? And when that moment comes, will we stand silent, or will we stand together?